All right, let's look at the common issue between Maya and Blender around the word group. So in the past, the word group in Blender means collections or a grouping of objects together in a organizational sense. They're called collections now in Blender 2.8 forward. The word group in Maya is a command. It's a function. It doesn't actually mean anything. It's a tool. So if I create a object, here I have a regular object. I move it around. It's in world space. I go ahead and add an object. I can do a cube here just to keep things organized. Add an object in Blender. I go to the item. I drag it around. You can see that it's in world space as well. So now we have both of these objects, and if I was trying to organize my file in Blender, I can use collections and group, quote unquote, the objects together. So if I had another cube and I duplicate my sphere, now I have two objects and two objects in Blender. And over here we can see that they're in this collision group, and I'm just going to call this col group, since that's what we're working on. And I have these other collections here I'm going to get rid of because I have a plugin that's adding them. Okay, so now I have these two things in this group, and in Maya I have nothing here. Now, a group, if I group them inside of Maya, it's going to add another pivot point. So if I was trying to organize my scene and I didn't want to add anything else to the file, the way I can kind of combine these together is using display layers. So I can create a layer and I can add them to it. Col group, and I can save it, and then I can assign the objects. Right? I can add the selected objects. So now they are quote unquote grouped together as far as you can select, see them, right click, select the objects. In Blender, if I go to this collection, I can hide the collection. I can kind of deactivate it, which is a little bit different than what you can do with layers, but if I right click, I can say delete the hierarchy. I can select the objects in the collection. I can, from the object, I can say select other objects that are in the collection, and it's not adding anything to the file. So far, so good. So we know display layers and collections are very similar. The other way I can do this is through something called a set, and if I go to select, create a selection set, group set, and apply. Now I have something that's a little more associated with the way the collections work, in that I can add and subtract from the set. I can right click and say selecting members. I can mess with this as an object, have its own name, and it's just pointing to these things. So I can have multiple sets and have the objects in multiple sets. It's not exclusive unless I tell it to be. Same thing with collections. So now we have two variations of doing kind of the same thing with different sets of functionality. So the collection in Blender acts as a little bit more of a display render layer control, plus like an unloading or loading of objects. And you can have multiple objects in different collections. If I create another display layer, and I were to add these two objects, add selected objects, it's removed them from this other group. So display layers cannot have multiple objects assigned to them. You can basically just assign one exclusively to a layer or not. Where sets, you can have multiple selection sets with those objects. So again, similar to collections. Now let's look at the word group. So the word group in Maya is a command. If I go to basically group an object, or ungroup. And then you see below it parent and unparent. Okay, so if I go to parent first, you have the option to preserve position or move objects. So if I look at sphere 1 and 2, if I grab sphere 2 and click on it and I say parent, now you can see that sphere 2 has moved to sphere 1, but it kind of kept its offset. So if this was 0, now 0 is going to move it to be a its animation, for example, or its reference coordinate system is now relative to the parent. So this is just parenting, right? If I move this object, and had I parented it with preserve position, let me go ahead and unparent this. So I'm going to parent sphere 2 to sphere 1 and say preserve position. So now this object has not moved, but you can see that if I grab this, these values are going to update to basically maintain position, but they're going to be referencing this new object. So now these have new values because this object is no longer displaying world space, it's displaying coordinates that are relative to the parent. So we can zero it and it's going to move to the parent. And this is how Maya's parenting works. And we can unparent and tell it to stay in place. If I go to edit, unparent, P, shift P, you can say preserve position or parent to the world. So we unparent and it's going to keep the position. I can say unparent and it's going to try to kind of jump it back to whatever offset it had before. So most people in Maya, when they're parenting, shift P, or unparenting, no one goes into these options very often that I've ever seen. We either hit P to select to parent objects together. So if this is unparented, I'm going to just grab this and hit P and it's parented. Or I'm going to hit Shift P and I left those settings. So let me go ahead and turn that back on and hit apply. Okay, so if I parent or I unparent, now the object stays put. It switches between displaying world space or parent space. And this gets used a lot when people are connecting objects. Now if I go to Blender and I do a parent operation, one more last thing before we go back to Blender, I can just also middle mouse drag this to another object and it will parent it. So let's look at parenting in Blender. If I grab my cube 2, let me actually call this cube 2 so that we can keep track of it, like Maya cube 2 and cube 1. So I can hold shift down and drag it onto here and it will parent and it stays in place. That's cool. If I then zero this though, you can see it goes to the world. Blender by default does not show you the local coordinate world system. It is very much showing you the object relative to the world. And that's kind of because it has a hidden matrix operation going on in the background. And it gets set when you drag and drop it. So let me go ahead and undo again. So now I'm going to go ahead and select this one, cube 2 and cube 1, and I'm going to do parent. So the same as hitting shift or hitting P in Maya, I'm going to do control P. And I get the option to set the parent to the object, to keep transformation, without inverse, parented to a vertex or triangle. So in this case, we're just going to talk about object, and you can see it makes parent, and then you also have the ability to keep transform. And then there's a bunch of other parent operations that you can kind of choose, parenting directly to an armature or bone. But there's no easy way to zero this to the parent. In order to do that, you have to go to the origin, and you can say clear origin. And when it clears origin, it basically recalculates the transformation and references the parent space now. So if I hit 0, it creates like it doesn't store the offset correctly. It moves it to 0 now. So if I hit 0, you can see that it's not quite aligned to the origin, but it is the way you can snap it to the parent object. And that's just a quirk of the way Blender's matrix operations work. It means that if you parent something that's animated, Blender's not going to change the space on you without you knowing, and it's going to keep the animation. Where if something's animated, when you change the parent, it's going to impact what the animation curve looks like. So this is a big change between the two and something you really have to understand as far as parent-child relationships. So now let's look at the word group. We can dig into all the Blender parent operations another time, but I just want to showcase the group command. So I'm going to go ahead and Shift-P and unparent this object, and in here I'm going to Alt-P and clear the parent. And I could also Alt-P and say keep transformation, and that works just like Maya. Okay, so now this object is back in world space and it's sitting here ready to move around. So we have our two objects. In Maya, if I wanted to basically use the word group to run a macro to do several functions, that's what's going to happen. So if I grab these two objects and I do Control-G, or I go to the group command, you can see that there are lots of options. What to group under, meaning like if you have multiple hierarchies, is it going to group under the previous parent, or is it going to group to the world? Where does the pivot go? Is it going to add the new pivot for the group to the center of the world, or is it going to group it in the kind of center of the object and then preserve position? So we're going to leave this default. I'm going to hold Control-G down and hit group. So now you can see that the new origin is at 0, and there's a new node called group. This is a transform with no shape on it. So if I were to basically go to Blender and add a mesh plane, let's say, and I call this group 1, then I go into edit mode and I were to delete all of the faces, or delete the faces or vertices or whatever. So now it's basically got no geometry. Go back to object mode. So now it's just a pivot point. And you can see that it's just another node in the hierarchy. Okay, so if I grab the cube and the group and I parent it, you can now see that if I grab the group and drag it around, this is the same thing that's happening in Maya. I'll use my manipulator. Okay, so I've recreated the exact same thing Maya has done for us. We've basically created an object that has no mesh data on it. It's just transformation. And this is just transformation, and it's a hierarchy. So when people in Maya talk about grouping, they're talking about adding a new object to the scene and automatically parenting the selected objects under it, keeping their position. Now, the reason Maya users use group a lot, let's say I grab these again and I group again. So now you can see that I'm quickly building a stacked hierarchy of nodes, and each of these could be renamed to do something. So there are extra pivots in the scene. So I can move the pivot around, or if we talk in Blender terms, the origin. I can move the origin around so that this group is rotating from down here, and this group is got its origin up here, so I can rotate here, or I can scale from there, or I can scale from here, right? It's just a hierarchy of transforms, the same as you would organize and group things here. Max and Blender both typically don't have this empty transform. They prefer to use, or people typically use something called in Blender an empty, or a locator, or a null. And so Maya has the same idea as a locator, and the locator here is a display object. It's a specific type of object. It has some extra information on it than just a transform node with no shape. So a locator is a little different, and it serves a different purpose, but it can act as a hierarchy group pivot, and it's used in rigging a bunch. Just like all the groups are used in rigging quite often, or to organize parts of an object and then people want to be able to animate and transform these things, but you can see that when I do that, the sphere has no scale on it because it's the parent object is what contains the scale. So not only is it organizing, it's also allowing the Maya user to create different transforms. In Blender's case, we've got this idea of a group, just like Maya, but there's no automated quick way now. If I were to grab the cube, right, if I grab these two cubes, if I wanted to create another group node and parent them to it automatically, there's nothing really out of the box that's going to do that. There is a special add-on that will allow you to kind of automate this. There's a plugin, different things like that. So the plugin creates a plane axis type node, right, which is an empty in Blender's case. And you can see here it's also seen as a different object type, much like the locator in Maya. So the locator and the empty are the same. And it has properties like size, and you can change it to look like different things, circles, cones, images. So this is a multifunctional object. And the locator here has a locator scale as well, so you can change the location scale and offset its position. And here you can scale this to 0 if you basically just wanted a pivot point. Okay, so these are the compatible ideas. For an actual group operation for Blender, the reason that they kind of don't have this same concept is because the hierarchy information doesn't really act the same. So a lot of times we're trying to create groups to offset things and not mess up transformations or to create different pivot points. And if we look at the concept here, doing this by hand is slow. And so now if we go to preferences and we go to add-ons and we look at extras, I think, mesh extra objects. So I click this and activate it. And you can go to the documentation, but now that it's active, if I grab these two objects, add, mesh, parent to empty, you can see that it's created a new empty, and you can tell it what it's called, if it's going to be placed at the cursor or at the active location, create a group, add a prefix. So again, this has some options similar to the Maya grouping. Alt, clear parent. Okay, so now if I go to add, mesh, parent to empty, now you can see that it created a new object and reparents, but this only works for objects that haven't been parented to something before. If I select these again and we run the same command again, you can see that it creates it, but it doesn't actually reparent. So this is a limitation to this add-on where, again, a Maya user is going to be able to control G 20 times and get all these groups, and the two objects are always parented underneath. So this is a kind of a limitation with the built-in understanding of creating a group pivot point system. With a little work, the built-in one could be modified to continue to reparent objects, but I just wanted to make this as clear as possible to show that the ideas are compatible, that both systems are working pretty similarly. The difference is that Maya's changing the transformation space relative to the parent in these groups, and Blender is doing a hidden matrix operation. In new Maya, right, Maya 2020 Plus with the offset parent matrix, that's basically what Blender is doing when you parent things and tell it to keep the translation. It has a hidden parent matrix. So if I were to say clear parent inverse, you'll see that these are basically the same ideas as Maya using the parent inverse matrix to reparent things and keep it with the same value. I hope that helps clear up some of the language issues and some of the understanding. And the last thing I'll say is, for Maya users in rigging, when we're trying to zero something out, typically we're using groups to store offsets, and then the child object is still 0. The reason Blender doesn't kind of have the same concept, or Blender users don't use this a lot, is because they're rigging inside of an armature, and the armature, if I add a single bone, the armature has its own reference coordinate system and mode. So if I place an armature here, right, and then I go to pose it, when I drag it over and animate it, now when I clear the transform, it's going to go back to the reference pose that it was built in this edit mode. So if I rotate this, for example, and translate it, and I go to pose mode, you can see that it's updated. Now if I move this and I again clear transform, it's going to jump back to that offset between these two modes. So Blender managing a rig is storing the offset between the bone creation mode and the pose mode. And a Maya user basically has to manage all of that offsetting with extra pivot points and groups, because Maya is always referencing the parent space. So that's why you tend to not see the need for multiple groups and pivot points and all this stuff, and kind of hacking around this behavior, where Blender, you can just select the bone and move it and know that its rest pose or its state in edit mode is the offset. So whenever you're in pose mode, any animation that happens is relative to the creation mode in edit, right? It's relative to this space. If you change this location and rotate the bone here, then the animation that's been created does offset, just like Maya does. If you animate this object and then change it to a new parent, that parent space relationship is going to change. All right, I hope this helps clear up some information for both sides, because I see users get bogged down in trying to understand each other with this a lot. And the real issue is just that there's kind of some hidden flexibility inside of Blender, where Maya is giving you more consistent behavior for this grouping and parenting as a macro. But if you're coming from Maya and you're looking at Blender to use either layers or sets, then you're going to use collections. And you can create collections, new collections, and you can organize stuff that way, like you would layers or sets. If you're looking for the idea of grouping objects as a parent operation, then you're either going to directly parent, drag and drop parent, or use the control P operation to parent objects. Or you're going to be in a rigging mode, and then you're going to still do parenting, but the two systems, the edit creation mode and the pose mode, are going to store the offsets for you without having to create all of these groups and store the offsets and manage all these systems. That's it. Thank you.